Okay, good afternoon and welcome to our webinar. This is the sixth in our series that we started off in mid-March, and we're really excited to bring you our presentation today is on assessing development and providing feedback, thinking about language assessment in a virtual environment. And we have a couple of our colleagues here today to share with us, Dr. Meg Monty and Jamie Morgan, and I'll introduce them in just a bit. My name is Annie Duguay, and thank you for joining us. It's very exciting to see where everyone is coming from, and of course at this time where we're not able to travel, and so many of us are ESL teachers or enjoy traveling. It's nice to see where everyone's from: New York, Ohio, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, New Jersey, Washington, Maryland, Missouri, West Virginia, Texas, Iowa, Oklahoma, Florida, Massachusetts, California, Puerto Rico, Georgia, Ontario, and Saskatchewan, Hawaii. Great, aloha. So wonderful start, and you can keep Oregon, you can keep all those locations coming to us because it's very exciting to see where everyone's coming from. And just a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. You can always contact us at solutions@cal.org if you have questions or any follow-up. We are tweeting at the Cal Linguistics Twitter feed. And if you have an activity that you try or an aha moment you want to share, you can also use the hashtag #LanguageApplied. There is a handout today. There is a drop down within your control panel on GoToWebinar with the option to download the handout, which today is the PowerPoint for today. So you'll be able to follow along, but no need to download it if you'd like to follow us to our resources page where we'll have this archived webinar and all the handouts. So today we are you are all should be muted. That's just the functionality of GoToWebinar. If you can't hear me, that's obviously a challenge. And so I've just highlighted there, the selection of computer audio is what we found works best for people. And so my colleagues will also be answering some of your questions as they come up. You will be kept on mute, and the questions box that you just used in order to shout out where you're coming from will be used as a chat box. So that's just the functionality of GoToWebinar, that it looks like you're asking a question, but it's actually akin to a chat box. The only issue is that your comment is not made visible or public until one of our colleagues responds to it. So when our Cal colleagues, today that's Maria and Maribel, when they respond to your comments, they become public and everyone will be able to see them in that questions box unless you have a very specific question that might not pertain to others. Feel free to write directly to Maribel and Maria through the questions box. And here you have the link to the Cal Resource Center with our online learning resources. So we do have a really robust schedule here of webinars, and we have new teams at Cal who are joining the webinar calendar here. So you see a variety of topics. Yesterday, there was one that will be moved to the archive section on a policy one takes around funding opportunities and some of the COVID-19 relief federal funding. So you can see that that archived version of the webinar already should be coming soon to this resource center page. Today's is assessment, and you'll see a variety of other topics, including for multilingual and dual language programs, such as next Tuesday on Spanish literacy. Again, all of these are on our website at the free resources page, and I'll keep linking this. We'll come back to this at the end of the PowerPoint as well, but likely many of you signed up for the webinars through this site. And then now we've sort of rearranged so that the registration is the top of that site, and then the archived webinars, as soon as we complete the webinar, will move to the bottom of the site, and you'll be able to click on the title of these webinars in order to view the presentation on YouTube. And then you also have the PDF handouts available to you there. And we do encourage you, many people have written to ask if they can use some of these materials with their students or fellow teachers. And yes, please continue to share and let us know as well if you find something particularly useful or you plan to implement it with students or teachers. So I'll circle back to some of those housekeeping points in those websites again. But our agenda for today, we're going to start with a few more introductions from you and our colleagues. Meg and Jamie are going to be defining assessment. What does it mean? Sometimes I find that teachers or facilitators or educators can be guilty of being intimidated by assessment, but I love the way that our colleagues keep us focused on assessment as a part of instruction, and that sometimes without even knowing we are assessing. So how can we do that in an equitable way that also prepares our learners? And specifically for language, what are some of the planning that we can do to ensure that we are planning for language assessment? And then creating a virtual assessment plan. So in this unique environment, many of us are teaching online. How can we assess in ways that aren't burdensome or impractical? So all of that good stuff we'll be chatting about today. We do want to hear from you. This is a poll that you've seen before, but as each week we have a little bit of a different audience. Wanted to hear from you. We know you wear many hats, so how are you joining us today? What is the role you're joining us from today? And if one of these does not describe your role, please go ahead and put it into the questions box. Let us know what role you're playing primarily in joining us today. Okay, and I'm going to close the poll in just a moment. Looks like the majority of people have voted, and some people are on their phones or perhaps attending to other household issues and can't always get over and vote. So it does look like lots of you still pouring in with your votes. So I will share those results in just a moment, but we have majority teachers, but many administrators this week as well. So I'm going to close this poll and share the results with you. So majority teachers, and then a good percentage this week of administrators. So thank you for joining us. A few researchers. If you want to get more specific about your role, again, please use the questions box. And as a nod to the idea of our parents, we know that there's a lot of distractions sometimes going on, and a couple of us have dogs at home, and I can speak for myself that the mail carrier often comes at this hour. So if you're hear any of that in the background, then we apologize. But we're right there with you with some of the home distractions. So, okay. You have now seen these results, and I'm going to hide them and introduce my colleagues. And Meg and Jamie, Meg Monty and Jamie Morgan can go ahead and introduce themselves and also hear a little bit more from you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Meg Monty. I serve as the Director of Performance-Based Language Assessment at the Center for Applied Linguistics. And we're so glad to be with you this afternoon talking about how do we do assessment well in ways that are effective and meaningful in a virtual context. And you may not know that in addition to all the professional development work that we do at Cal, we also do a lot of work in language assessment and testing for English as a second language, international English, as well as world languages. So you may, if you give the WIDA test, Cal helps to develop the items and the test content for WIDA. And we also work on the New York State speaking, English speaking assessment, or NICE-SLAT. So we work on the speaking component of that. And also do a lot of work with classroom-based formative assessment and professional development in language assessment. So we're so glad to be talking with you about these issues today. And I'll hand things to Jamie.
Thanks, Meg. Hi, everyone. My name is Jamie Morgan, and I'm a senior research assistant in the Language Assessment Division at Cal, where, as Meg mentioned, we work on a variety of different language education projects. And I believe that we have a question that Annie has put together for us to include in our introductions. So what is one hobby that we have engaged in during this time? Meg, would you like to start?
Sure. So while our colleagues are putting in their answers in the question box, I don't know if this counts as a hobby, but I have become very into crossword puzzles for the past few weeks and found that they're a nice way to relax and it doesn't involve a screen, which I really appreciate.
Great. And one hobby that I've taken up while spending time at home is painting, which I've been learning with the help of some free online tutorials and videos. I am not quite an expert yet, but it's certainly a fun way to pass the time.
Great, and I see a few answers here from a number of you in terms of doing art, planting, great time for that, painting, reading, homeschooling, cooking, trying new recipes, watching webinars, sewing, and some of us I know are rediscovering our inner child, and apparently today is National Children's Day in some parts of the world, so. You can continue adding your hobbies there, and we'll move on.
Great, thank you, Annie. And thank you again to everyone for being here today. Before we get started with the content of today's webinar, we wanted to briefly share some information that we gathered from participants that attended last week's webinar, which may include some of you. So in preparation for today's session, we asked participants to respond to two different questions. How are you currently assessing your students? And what are your biggest challenges in virtual assessment? So on this slide, we've briefly summarized the responses that were received. And as you can see, many educators expressed not yet implementing assessment into their online teaching practice for a variety of reasons, some of which are captured here in the list of challenges. For those participants that indicated they are currently assessing their students, many expressed doing so informally with the support of online instructional platforms, many of which have audio and video capabilities that allow for group meetings and discussions. In addition, many participants expressed the importance of communicating informally with students and parents just about their needs and home language practices as a way to assess where they are and what supports are required. As far as challenges go, participants highlighted issues of accessibility and availability of technology, attendance and participation in synchronous activities, limitations to instructional time, format, and delivery, and of course, difficulties of assessing communication skills outside of the traditional classroom setting. So now that we have a better sense of some of your virtual assessment practices, let's move on to our content and language objectives for today's webinar. In this session, you will learn how to create a realistic assessment plan, align assessment to your context, objectives, and resources, and use checklists and rubrics to provide feedback, all while certainly discussing language assessment in virtual environment. So first, we're going to talk about how we should approach assessment. So let's start by inviting you to contribute to this discussion by answering the following question. What's one word that comes to mind when you think of assessment? Please write your response in the question box, and members of our team will be reading and responding to your answers. Let's take about 1 minute to respond, and then Maria and Mary Bell can potentially share out some of these responses.
This is Meg. I'm happy to start reading some of these. I know some of our other moderators are responding to you in the chat box. I'm seeing a lot of great responses here. I think probably maybe the most easiest thing that comes to mind is test, which has come up a few times here. But I'm also seeing things about the purpose of assessment, so evaluation, feedback, as well as some of the values that go into assessment, like equity, access, advocacy, things like that. I see the terms like formative and summative coming up quite a bit, as well as some of the skills that you can assess, like performance and speaking, things like that. So lots and lots of great answers there.
Great, thanks, Meg. So as you can see, there are a number of different words that we associate with the term assessment, and these can certainly vary greatly based on our teaching context and experiences and our particular situations. So for the purposes of today's webinar, we really want to share our definition of classroom-based assessment so that we can all have a shared understanding of this term. So this type of assessment is really a way to gather information about our students' language growth, and we really want to emphasize the importance of viewing assessment through this lens, rather than simply thinking of assessment as a formal test. It's an ongoing process of setting clear objectives for student learning and evaluating progress toward those objectives. And lastly, it's an opportunity to enhance, empower, and celebrate students' learning, which is so important during this time of so much uncertainty and difficulty that may be present in our students' lives. We really want to encourage you to think about assessment as a chance to motivate and encourage your students in their language development and really make this a positive component of your virtual instructional plans. So now that we have a shared understanding of classroom-based language assessment, let's discuss some of the different approaches to assessment, particularly those that pertain to our new realities. As you know, there are many different types of assessment that can be used to gather information to fulfill our needs. Many of these are types of assessments that we may be having some difficulty with implementing in a virtual environment. And many of you are considering ways to adapt your traditional end-of-year assessments that may or may not be feasible in this context. So given these changes, it's really important to remember that formal and standardized tests are not the only forms of assessment. We really want to focus on collecting information about our students' language use and development at this time, rather than placing our emphasis on the assessment event or test that may typically be taking place. That being said, we highly recommend using formative assessment for monitoring and documenting student progress in a virtual environment, as it can be a powerful tool for you to use in a meaningful way with your students. So now we'll talk a little bit more about formative assessments. As formative assessments are used during the course of instruction, we think this can be a really valuable approach to assessing your students remotely. These results can be used to inform instruction, which is incredibly useful during this time, especially considering the fact that many of us are using a wide variety of instructional tools and methods that we may not have used in the past. And this type of assessment can really support you in understanding what is working well and what you may need to change to create an effective virtual learning environment. Results can also be used to provide feedback to students, parents, your instructional team, administrators, and other stakeholders. Another great thing about formative assessment is that it can be tailored to meet the needs of you, your students, and your program. There are so many different types of formative assessment that can be selected and used, including observations, presentations, informal conversations, journals, and more. Now, before we move on to the next section of the presentation, we'd like to hear from all of you about your experience with formative assessment. What is one example of a formative assessment that you have used or could use in a virtual environment? What makes it effective for a virtual context? Again, please respond by typing your answers in the questions box, and members of our team will be reading and responding as needed.
Okay, I'm seeing some answers start to appear. We have things like tools, coming up like Flipgrid, portfolios. I'm seeing polls, exit quizzes or short quizzes at the end of class have been mentioned a few times. I'm seeing breakout room pair work. Okay. Group conversation observation. I like that one. Speaking is my area of focus, so I always like to see speaking assessments in there. And short video clips with pictures. So those are a few of the examples our participants are starting to put in.
Great, thank you, Meg. Well, I will actually turn things over to Meg now to continue on and discuss creating an assessment plan.
Great, thanks, Jamie. I hope that spending some time talking about how we're thinking about assessment is helpful right now, because I think when we're in a context, we're not just talking about virtual assessment, we're talking about virtual assessment during a pandemic and a crisis. And so a lot of the things that we normally do may no longer be possible. And with everything changing, I think it can be helpful to really root ourselves in an understanding of assessment simply as a way to gather information about our students' learning and development in language to do certain things, to make certain decisions, whether that's about instruction, whether it's about trajectories of learning and class placement, right? We're just getting information and using it to make decisions. And so I think that can be very freeing, as some of the standard ways we might assess students and more formal tests are not available or feasible right now. There are still lots of ways we can get the information we need and document it appropriately for our purposes. And that's really what we're focusing on today. So I'm going to walk through some key questions moving ahead in creating an assessment plan. And the remainder of our presentation will be centered around these key questions. So first we have, what contextual factors or constraints do I need to account for in my assessment plan? And we'll talk briefly about some of the issues you're seeing right now and how those may affect what is effective assessment-wise. Next, we have realistic instructional language and content objectives, and also prioritization, asking what's really most important to me right now, because that should be reflected in what I choose to assess. Okay. What decisions do I need to make, both now and in the future, about my students, and what information would help me make those decisions? Okay. And what tools or resources do I have available to collect and document this information? And finally, how will my assessment plans affect my students and their families? So thinking about the impact of this on the students that we serve. All right. So let's dive in with the first question about contextual factors and constraints. And moving ahead, some key considerations. So understanding, really an assessment plan is rooted in understanding and responding to the challenges that we're currently facing. And some of these include limited access to resources, as Jamie mentioned, and that can apply both to students and to educators in terms of the technology available, changing curriculum, as well as assessment requirements, maybe at a state or district level, technological issues and troubleshooting, amount of instructional time is changing, as well as delivery methods, and differences in classroom and home literacy practices, practical issues of student and teacher availability, and situational stress, and the need to really prioritize social and emotional well-being right now, and having that be the framework through which we see our assessment decisions. So as you take stock of your own context, just thinking through how are these considerations going to play into what I'm able to assess right now and how I'm able to do that. Okay. And then, I was glad to see we have so many administrators with us today. There may be additional needs from your assessment information that are beyond your own instruction. So that may be including documenting results to advocate for the needs of English learners, to ensure policy compliance, to make informed classroom decisions for next year. So what do teachers next year need to have documented and know to do their planning, collecting and reporting data for school or district monitoring, and needs around communicating information to other stakeholders, including administrators. So I think it's helpful to think both at the very micro level, but also take a step back and think about what do I need to assess and document for these other higher level considerations. Okay. And as we kind of dive into this more, I do want to highlight, we talked about the challenge between school-based literacy practices and home literacy practices. And just want to take a moment to note that thinking about the home literacy practices and the home language practices of your students can be really helpful as you begin to plan for assessment. These may not be things that are often formally recognized and honored through standardized tests or other school measures, but they can be really rich sources of learning. And so just thinking about how might I engage with and support these practices, not through necessarily a formal assessment, but just promoting them, documenting them in some way if you're regularly talking with parents or caregivers, so that these are seen as a rich source of development, particularly in students' home languages during this time. And I think as educators, we often have ways to advocate for that and communicate the importance of those things as we work with our stakeholders. So I wanted to also, we will be talking a lot about English proficiency assessment today, but I think there's a lot of rich things happening with home language right now that are worth honoring and celebrating in addition to language growth. Okay. So as we think about rooting our assessment plans in a rich understanding of context, I think that really sets us up to think about, okay, well then what is realistic for me to do instructionally right now in terms of language and content, and what are my priorities? Because we know that any effective assessment plan should be rooted in what's happening instructionally. Those two absolutely should be aligned, right? Because assessment is one of the most powerful ways that as educators, we communicate to our students what's important. If we don't assess something that we're doing instructionally, the meta message there is this may not matter that much, right? And so just making sure that as much as we're able, we're making these things line up together so that we're instructing based on our priorities and we're assessing based on those. And of course, setting clear language and content objectives is the way that we can help make sure that happens. So if we move ahead, I'm going to just talk a little bit about language objectives. If you're familiar with the SIOP model, these are kind of coming from that perspective. And we're not going to spend too much time on setting objectives today, but these are objectives that address the language needed to achieve content objectives. So what are the language demands of a particular content function? And when you're thinking about language objectives and language development, you may want to consider, assuming you have those laid out and maybe modifying them, think about, can this objective be addressed through virtual instruction? And then can I assess this objective virtually and how? And on the next slide, I just want to give an example of a language objective. So one language objective, you can think about this as for an upper elementary school science content area. I might say that students will be able to orally describe characteristics of liquids, solids, and gases to a partner. So there I have speaking skills, oral description within the domain of science, and interpersonal communication through partner work that's kind of embedded within this language objective. So if this were my starting point, then moving ahead, I would think about, well, what are my priorities? Now that I'm in a virtual teaching environment, what is really important to me here when I look at this objective? Well, in just a very simple way, I want my students to be talking about content. Even in a virtual environment, I think I can make that happen, and that oral language development around content concepts is really important to me. So that I think is a priority. And then I might also say, I want my students to use key terms and vocabulary when they're speaking. And I want them to be able to develop some of this sustained descriptive language for discussing science. And so that's what's really important to me. So moving forward, then I could modify this objective for a virtual context. And I might first say, you know what, I don't have the capacity to do a lot of partner work virtually. I'm not going to be able to pair up my students and put them in partnered conversations together around science and then observe them the way that I would in a classroom. So I might need to do this in a more structured way via small group video conversations that are more efficient. I can meet with more students at once. We're still speaking, but I can observe multiple students in one arena. So it's not the same mode communicatively as a paired conversation, but it does allow for oral language engagement. And then I might say, you know, a related goal that I can add to this actually is that I think I can teach my students about participating in group video chats. And there's actually some wonderful linguistic or related skills that we can develop during this time. Simple things like how to mute and unmute yourself to talk, right? And what's good etiquette around that. So I might kind of add that into my expectations for what I want to do. And then I might just start to ask some questions about this goal. So maybe not changes to the wording, but I might kind of adjust my expectations around what the outcomes will be. Are my students going to be able to really develop the quantity and complexity of language that I might have been able to get through classroom instruction? You know, maybe that developmental trajectory is slowing down a little bit right now, and so that's okay. I just need to recalibrate to what we can actually do. And then, you know, asking kind of like, how am I going to capture this video participation data, and thinking about the logistics of group chat, right? Because that also is a new area that may take some work. And I might think, well, you know, some of my students, and this came up in your practical comments, they aren't able to attend these group video chats. So maybe I need some multiple avenues for getting this information and some alternative ways to both instruct and assess on this. So this is just a simple example of how you might think about and modify a language objective for our new virtual context, particularly in the area of speaking. Okay. So I'd love to hear from you right now. Just what's an example of a language objective that you have for your students? And how are you thinking about adjusting this to make it realistic for your current context? So how has the move to virtual instruction changed your language objectives? Or are they moving ahead as expected? So if you enter those questions or your comments into the question box, I'll ask one of my colleagues in a moment to read those aloud so we can hear some of your responses.
Okay, this is Annie. I see a few responses here, and I know people are still populating. A few responses, the idea that the objectives are becoming simpler and even more specific. Focusing a lot of written expression, but encouraging use of recordings for speaking. So trying to maybe balance different modalities within your objectives. You know, using technology. So kind of what Meg was just saying about developing sort of what is the language of technology. It's a very different thing if, you know, clearly Meg, Jamie, Maribel, Maria, and I are in different, we're in different states and different locations around the DC region. But so we have to hand off, you know, without seeing each other right now. And communicate through a variety of behind the scenes technology. So these are professional skills that are, and language skills that our students need to acquire. So changing certain group activities to one-on-one, increase around reading requirements, and then writing complete sentences to give instructions from any games they're participating in. I'll just talk a little bit, few more. So people are taking the opportunity to develop objectives around where students are right now, maybe a description of their homes or their lifestyle, healthy choices. Yeah, more discussions of kind of real world authentic content. So few people have alluded to that or made that point, just that it's a great time to seize upon the content, in students' worlds, whether that be sometimes medical or social emotional wellness. Someone suggested learning pleasantries. So there's a lot of opportunities to leverage both for content reasons and objectives, and tailoring that to the moment that we're in right now.
Yeah, thanks, Annie. It's great to see this discussion about some of the content that's changing, right? Or in some cases, also the language skills that we're assessing are taking a different focus based on what's practical right now. And so whenever we're thinking about the question of, well, what should I do for assessment? It always has to be rooted in, okay, well, what am I doing? What are my goals, right? What am I trying to achieve, and how am I instructing for those? And then I think the assessment plans become easier to navigate because the links between those should become more clear. Okay, great. We'll move on to the next section, and I want to talk about decision making and information, and thinking about the information demands of our situation and how we can meet those through assessment. So whenever we're facing the question of what should I do about assessment, there are two key questions that we should always come back to. The first is, what do I want to know? What's my purpose, or what information am I trying to get? And then how will I use this information? What are the decisions that I need to make using it? And I want to talk through these in a little bit more detail. Using this example of the objective that we had. So I'm going to come back to this language objective of students being able to orally describe the characteristics of liquid, solids, and gases in a structured conversation. And so right now, we won't talk about this, but think about this, this objective. Think about these two key questions. How would you answer these? What information might you want to know about students' learning for this objective, and then what decisions might you make about this information? Okay, and as you're taking a moment to think about that and enter some responses, I'm going to show you what we would say for this example. So in terms of what we want to know, I might say, first, what is the quantity and quality of language that my students can produce orally when describing scientific properties? And I might even want to say really specifically, according to the WIDA standards or the WIDA English Language Development Framework, what does that language look like? And I also might want to know, to what extent are my students using key content terms and structures when speaking? And finally, are my students able to participate in video chats? So more on the technology skills side. And then in terms of information use, I might say, well, I do need to document their progress in language development. I want to be able to say something about their proficiency in speaking in particular, and provide some evidence of that, so that I can plan my own instruction and think about where my students need more practice, and maybe some tech support as well. And then I also do want to share this progress with my students and their families, right, in a positive way that's going to motivate and support them. But there's that feedback component as well. So those are the informational purposes that I need this data for, as well as the type of data that I want. So going through this kind of exercise of answering these questions when you are thinking about an objective can really help support moving on to validity, making sure that assessments are appropriate. Now, when we talk about validity, particularly in a formative sense, that's what we're really talking about. It's the alignment between the tools that you're using and the choices that you're making, whether that's a test, a portfolio, a self-assessment, and the purpose and use that you need them for. And it's related to how well the assessment matches intended purpose and use, and whether the information that you collect is sufficient for that. Okay? And I just want to say a quick example to maybe make that a little bit more concrete. You can think about if you need to assess English language writing proficiency. The kind of assessment that is appropriate for planning instruction is very different than exit criteria for English learners, right? So it's the same, the what of your assessment is the same, but the use that you're putting it to is different. And so different tools would, of course, be appropriate. One could be a more informal assessment. One, you would want to have a rigorous, thoroughly tested assessment that you could really rely on in order to make high stakes decisions. So just a short example to illustrate how validity can work in our decision making. Okay. And so I think, our advice for assessment is during this time of crisis and change, consider whether or not assessment needs to be a formal event in the ways that we may have been used to. Something to think about is, will using a formal assessment, will having a test add some unnecessary anxiety to students and their families? And are there ways that as an educator, you can gather sufficient information to meet your needs through creative or more informal approaches? And one thing that I always tell instructors is that, a lot of times I'll hear, well, I'm not doing assessment right now. But I think that good instructors are always doing assessment, right? They're always observing how their students are responding, how they're learning, and adjusting to that, even if it's not being documented. And so sometimes addressing assessment is just a matter of adding documentation, particularly to instructional activities that can help us gather that information. And we'll look at an example of a checklist in a minute for you to do that. But I think rubrics and checklists are really helpful tools right now that can help shape learning when shared both before and after assessment. And they give students, an opportunity to understand their own proficiency development. Okay. So with that, I am going to talk now about tools and resources to collect and document information. And we'll touch on this topic more briefly, but I think it's very important to leverage existing resources right now so that you keep things very simple for you and your students. Right? What do you have that you can use given the priority of what you want to assess and document? And then how can you do this during instruction? And I think as much as possible, using the same tools and procedures for both assessment and instruction, rather than trying to bring in new things, can be very helpful. And then finally, adapting the resources used in your state for describing language development. So I mentioned two assessments that Cal works on, WIDA and the New York State speaking component of NYSESLAT. And so those states have those proficiency trajectories that you can use and align your classroom tools to that. I think is very helpful. Okay. So the value of using those proficiency measure or proficiency scales for developing your own checklists and rubrics or adapting them is that it gives you a common language for talking about student development, right? That's translatable outside of your classroom in a way that sometimes grades are not, right? What can students do with language in really concrete terms, and what can they produce? And this helps to communicate to lots of different stakeholders through this alignment to external proficiency descriptors. Okay. So I'm going to come back to this example one more time, and I'm going to talk about how this could be assessed using a checklist. So again, we have this idea of oral description in structured group conversations with these particular goals. So if we move ahead, I want you to think about, if you were going to assess this, what would make sense to you, and put some of your examples and answers into the chat box. And I will show you what we came up with on our side. So this is a sample checklist for assessing speaking that I would use in a group discussion context. And we created this by referencing the WIDA performance definitions for speaking and writing, as well as our own objectives but you could use any proficiency framework to develop something like this. So this is something that you could use that would give you some very simple diagnostic information about students' language development when you're structuring a group discussion. And you could do this, you could let students know you're observing them, or you could just gather this information for your own instructional purposes. It would really depend on your goals. But you might want to know things like, can the student mute or unmute themselves in the video? What quantity of language are they producing? Here I've said 2 to 3 oral sentences is what I was looking for. I could document if they're using that key vocabulary to add detail. And I might also want to gather some information about their general comprehensibility or their fluency, things like that. And then using this tool, I could just very simply capture yes or no, or I could also annotate it a little bit to give me a sense of how that particular student is doing. Maybe they're not quite producing oral sentences and I'm getting short phrases, and so I would want to note that. So something like this can become just a really simple and efficient way to add some assessment information into the classroom practices that you're already planning. Okay. And, you know, we didn't really dive into, in this presentation, specific recommendations for tools, because I think that often other educators are the best source of that. You will often know better what's current and what's most helpful for your context. But we did see a lot of participants last week mention particular tools that they're using to gather this kind of data. And so I just wanted to highlight those for a moment. So Blackboard Collaborate, Flipgrid comes up pretty frequently, Google Classrooms, Teams, Schoology, Seesaw, and Zoom. So what we're seeing right now is that there are just so many tools and platforms and that people are using a wide variety. So what we hope is that you're getting a way of thinking about assessment from our presentation today that you can then take into whatever platform or particular tool you have available and apply that there. And
Meg.
with that, oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Hi, Meg. This is Annie. A question popped up in the question box that relates to this page, this slide, and it's about a great question about many of our classroom teachers have never created a computer-based test, right? And I know Cal has gone through that process for some of the tests we have developed. And the question is, how does one go from a paper-based test to an online test without a great deal of new technology? Or are there any sort of tips you have based on experience of moving paper-based tests to online format?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is often very dependent on the technology tools that you have available and what they can support. Is it simple, you know, they often have some kind of survey or testing function that may have multiple choice, selected response type features, or simple information entry. So I think that would, you would really have to know what is possible. And I would say, you know, my advice would be to leverage whatever you have within that tool rather than spending a lot of time looking for new options, because I think we just have to be efficient and simple right now. And, you know, maybe that the tool you're using doesn't really allow for that kind of online testing. I would say, you know, in general, my other piece of advice would be to really try to focus on assessing performance in the ways that you can. So speaking and writing, and what are ways that you can capture some information about student language in the productive domains. And I think that is a really effective and good focus right now.
Thanks, Meg.
Okay, thanks for that question. And I'm going to hand things back to Jamie to talk about the effect of our assessment plan.
Great, thanks, Meg. So the final question that we want to discuss for creating an assessment plan is, how will my assessment plans affect my students and their families? So of course, this is something that's important to consider in all all contexts, but particularly now in virtual environments and this current situation that we're facing, it's really important for us to think about the many difficulties that our students and families are facing, as Meg mentioned, and also keep social emotional well-being in a focus in our decision making. So one way that we can frame assessment in a positive way is by providing feedback that encourages and motivates students in their language development. So here we have feedback is defined as information provided to learners about their progress towards an objective. And it's really important to provide feedback that has all of these different components. So feedback needs to be goal-oriented, actionable, timely, ongoing, and consistent. And Meg mentioned that, so many of us are assessing our students actively as we are delivering instruction. And so it's really important that we're providing feedback that goes along with all of the observations that we're making and can be done in a consistent manner. So students need to be able to understand and apply feedback in a way that is really meaningful and practical, especially in a virtual learning environment. So these are just really important components of effective feedback that should be considered. So again, feedback is not a value judgment, so saying nice work or good job. It's not an evaluation or advice, but rather concrete information that students can really use to understand their progress and improve their performance. So on the next slide, we have some questions that may be helpful when planning virtual feedback. So some of the considerations include what impact will my feedback have on students' language development and motivation? How can it be delivered in a way that empowers them and positively frames their growth? What information does the assessment provide? How will I communicate feedback to students and families in meaningful and accessible ways? How can I make sure my feedback is targeted and actionable for my students? And how can I document assessment results for the future? So all of these are different points that really need to be considered to make sure that feedback is very effective for our students, families, and other stakeholders for future decisions that need to be made for courses in the upcoming year. So now, as we have a few minutes left in our time together today, we are going to wrap up on the next slide with a brief summary of some of the major takeaways from this presentation. So again, as Meg and I discussed, it's really important to develop realistic language objectives and align your assessments to these objectives. And we just want to reiterate that keeping assessment simple and consistent with instructional practices and things that you're already using is really a great way to go about assessment in this particular environment. Also, considering ways to document information from activities that you're already doing is a really easy way for you to ensure that you are incorporating assessment into your instructional practices. So specifically using some of the proficiency descriptors that Meg mentioned and using these to create rubrics and checklists that will really help you document student progress for your future needs. And finally, just a focus on how assessment and feedback can really be designed to support and motivate students. Again, we want this to be a positive component of your virtual instruction, and using informal, instructionally embedded assessments can be really effective in this virtual environment. So we have two final questions for you today. What is one assessment approach that you plan to implement? And what is one aha moment that you had during this presentation? So please feel free to type your answers into the question box, and we will monitor those and perhaps share some out if we have a few moments left.
Okay, oops. I'll keep those questions there for you. I do see a few comments coming in. And one person, Carolyn, suggested Meg's suggestion to, when you're converting those paper tests to platforms that you have and that are similar, that's those hopefully for the students, that will be familiar. And so if you've adopted a technology, Google Classroom or Zoom or one of those to help your students get as familiar as possible, maybe it's Flipgrid. And we're finding the same with teachers, rather. There are so many tools out there. So how do we kind of curate just a few that we'll use in our PD session so that people can really learn the functionality and display their knowledge and their thinking the most, in the richest manner based on their familiarity and comfort with that material. I know for our sake, our GoToWebinar has become more familiar to us as we move along here. A few of you said you plan to do just that and set some norms around the video chats, develop performance rubrics, develop more goal-oriented feedback. So a few of you saying that very normal, I believe, that maybe you're someone who had very formally ways of sharing out objectives, and maybe when you got going and made the quick transition to online learning, didn't bring some of those tools that you know so well in your classroom setting. So a good reminder to turn back to your objectives and really prioritize the ones that reflect the technology the students are using. And lots of suggestions around specific sites to use, such as Edpuzzle, quizzes, lots of great ideas here. I know my colleagues are trying to get the most of them to you, to be aware also of the literacy practice of the student's home. And thank you, Meg, for making that suggestion as well, that we really have an opportunity to leverage students' time with family members, perhaps who speak a first language or an additional language. I also wanted to ask one of the questions that popped up that Maria highlighted, and I suspect many of our audience members would have an answer too, so feel free to chime in on the questions box. But if Jamie or Meg have an answer, or any of my colleagues, the question is how to deal with the issue of perhaps easier, what might be considered cheating. So students, instead of doing a voice recording, they are reading from a script, or they are using Google Translate, not in my view. What are people's thoughts around how do you, perhaps do assessments knowing that students have more at their fingertips to participate? Anyone want to chime in on that one, or do so in the questions box?
Yeah, I'm glad you highlighted that, Annie, that caught my eye too, as coming up several times where people are asking about, how do I make sure students aren't cheating? What about copying? So I think that's, a consideration when you're looking at speaking and writing. And so one thing that you can think about is building tasks or questions that require students to do some sort of personal processing. So the difference between just, maybe describing, a scientific process or something that they could more easily read directly versus like something that is going to require some personal synthesis based on information that you have used during class. I also just feel like, there's a lot of things to consider and be concerned about right now. And my kind of general advice is work on building trust and communicating that to your students, that you trust them, to do your best to make tasks that allow them to show their language proficiency and development through performances. And then, that's just something like, even in a face-to-face environment, we can't prevent all cheating and all reliance on those things. And especially for beginning level students, often reading things or using adapted language from other sources can be a part of development. And so I wouldn't worry too much about overly penalizing students for those kinds of things or trying to too closely monitor it, because I think with all the other priorities that we have, it becomes lower.
Yeah, thank you, Meg. I know a few of our commenters also suggested, allowing students, making that part of an objective maybe of when to use resources and when you might ask them to, okay, I know you have Google Translate at your fingertips, please write this sentence into the chat box without using that. And then other times where you might say, I do want you to, use your thesaurus or, other word-to-word translations. That's a great time to also, many of our states on the state testing, which I realize is mostly not happening this year. But word-to-word translators is a skill that we can have our students practice and perhaps develop mini lessons around that at this time. So, and then conversely, there might be some live chats that you ask students to record or participate in so that we can assess more extemporaneous speech if that's your objective and goal. So thank you all for your responses today and for joining us for our sixth, I believe, webinar in this particular series. We do have a number of upcoming topics. We're very excited to present next Tuesday. Our colleague, Dr. Artea Goitia and Lisa Tabacu will be focusing on Spanish language and literacy development. That will be entirely in Spanish. Looks like the registration for that is quite full. So if you're interested in that May 5th webinar, if you sign up, if in the eventuality you're not able to participate, it will be archived for you on the same website that's at the below your screen right on this slide right here. So all of our registration information as well as upcoming topics are there, and the archive webinar from today will also appear there. A few questions also pop up around handouts and certificates. So within 24 hours, you will receive an email, and it will include a certificate with the time from today if you participated live. And it'll also have the registration link for next week's Friday webinar on re-energizing the brain, integrating language with the arts, physical education, and music in the home. So you'll find all of our topics for registration or archived on that site. Also, today's a big day. We're still working towards the end of our goal here, but you can indeed register now on our new online course, which is Building Background and Comprehensible Input. Part of our hopefully new series, Cal SciOp Essentials, well, coming soon to you, and with more in the works. And you can find that on our cal.org site. And there's an online courses drop down from the What We Do tab, or you can email solutions@cal.org to find out more about that new course. And lastly, a big thank you, most importantly, for joining us, for your participation in the questions box. There will be a ticket out with some questions around your participation today, an activity you might like to try, and then a question as well. So our colleagues from the Language Assessment Division were very thankful, and I really enjoyed the positive focus on how assessment can be an additive part of our instruction, and as one of the ways, as Meg said, that we as instructors, as teachers, signal what is important. So with that in mind, if you have a question around assessment, as we try to build more professional development around assessment for teachers, we welcome you to add it to our ticket out, and hope we'll see you either May 5th for Spanish language or Friday, May 8th on re-energizing the brain. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone, and thanks again for participating.